Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for coming. If you just open the newspaper or open any news site, and what do you see? What do we all see? We see Trump. We see the Mueller report. We see Brexit. When we look back at today from 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, and ask what was the story of this moment in our lives, this moment in the history of our species, it won't be Trump, and it won't be Mueller, and it won't be Brexit. It'll be that after 3.8 billion years of evolving by the set of rules we call Darwinian evolution of random mutation and natural selection, this was the moment, the incredible moment where we took the reins of our own evolutionary process. We took the reins increasingly of managing and manipulating biology. And think about that. I mean, this is a power that for our whole recorded history, we have ascribed to the gods. But now we are assuming the power of those gods that we have imagined. When Watson and Crick identified the double helix structure of DNA in the 1950s, what they were doing was recognizing that there is a book of life. And the book of life is structured into the famous DNA double helix. And when the Human Genome Project came to fruition in 2003, what was being identified was that the book of human life could be read in the A's and the C's and the T's and the G's. And now, with the advent of our world of precision gene editing, we're recognizing that this book of life can be written. So we're at Google now, and we think about what are technologies that are readable and writable and hackable. This is the house that IT built. But what if we come to see our biology as being as readable and writable and hackable as our IT? And that is where we're going. We have this view which doesn't really make sense, that our IT is variable, which is why we expect that every new version of our iPhone is going to be better than the last. But we also have this strange sense that our biology is fixed, that we are biologically going to be like our parents, that our kids are biologically going to be kind of like us. But when you take a step back and look at this from a historical perspective, well, it doesn't really make sense, because somehow 3.8 billion years ago, we were single-cell organisms. And then we got to be what we are now, Homo sapiens. We've only been this for about 300,000 years. And with all the changes that happen in evolution of any species, it would be crazy to imagine that Homo sapien was just the end of this evolutionary journey. So we know that we are on a path, that we are going to evolve. We are not going to stay Homo sapiens forever. And yet it's so hard for us to internalize that. And yet we are beginning this genetic revolution that is going to fundamentally transform the way we think about all of life, including our own. And it has and will have just tremendous upsides. We are going to be able to fix a lot of the bugs in humanity. And some of those bugs we call fate. Right now, when people die of terrible genetic diseases, including little kids, we say, God, it's terrible. What a terrible fate. What a terrible tragedy. And right now, when an older person gets dementia or Alzheimer's, we have a whole lifetime of investment in learning, in getting wisdom, in building relationships. And it's just thrown away. It's this incredible loss. Imagine if people had 5 more years of healthy life. What a tremendous contribution that would be, not just to them, but to all of us. How we would make the world so much better by unlocking these secrets of our biology. And that's wonderful, and we have to embrace that. And yet there are some very real dangers and downsides of taking this power that we have, as I said, attributed to the gods. Having this ability to recreate all of life comes with a tremendous responsibility. And the challenge is that this future is arriving far sooner than most people, most of us, myself included, fully understand or appreciate. And we're not ready. And that means everyone, you and me and everybody else. We need to recognize that this future is coming, and we have to prepare not just for ourselves, but because all of us have a responsibility in shaping this revolution to maximize the upside and minimize whatever potential harms there may be. And it's really up to us. So as many of you know, my new book, Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity, is out this week. The reason why I've written the book, the reason why I'm here speaking with you today, is I want everybody to recognize that the genetic revolution isn't some crazy sci-fi future. It's now, and it's here. And how it plays out is up to you, and you need to see yourself as an essential hub in that process. So this revolution is going to play out and is already playing out in three major areas. The first one is in our healthcare. We still live in a world of generalized healthcare based on population averages. And that means that if you go and you're taking most drugs, you get a drug that is given to you based on a guess based on population averages. Let's say you have a cancer. For 88% of people in the United States, you get a cancer drug, and it's not based on you individually, your own individual biology. It's just based on the type of cancer, in many cases, that you have. And it's not just a third, but let's just say it is for now. Let's say there's a third of a chance it'll help you, a third of a chance it'll do nothing, and a third of a chance it'll harm you or kill you. And so if it helps you, great, you found the right drug on the first try. If it doesn't, then you have a new drug with those same percentage chances of each outcome. And that's a crazy way to do medicine if we can do better. And we can do better, and we're starting to do better. And that is leading us into this world of personalized or precision medicine based on each person's individualized biology. And what that means is that when you go to your doctor, you will get, for example, drugs prescribed based not just on population averages, but based on your personal biology, understood through genome sequencing and biometrics and other things. When you have cancer, right now there's a revolution in how cancers are being treated. You will be treated based on the sequencing of your cancer cells and your cancer tumors to get treatments based on you. When you think of all kinds of treatments where there's an N of thousands, right now there are new treatments called gene therapies where you have, we can call it cancer, your cells are taken out, they are manipulated to boost your natural cancer-fighting capabilities, and those cells are put back into your body, those stem cells, and then they proliferate and can be used to fight cancer. And so in all of these, it's an N of 1, and that N is you. And what that means, though, is that to gain access to the world of precision medicine, everyone is going to need to have their genome sequenced, and we're going to need to have uniform health and other life records. And what does that mean? Well, it means that right now we are in maybe low millions of people have had their whole genome sequenced, but we are moving into a world where it will be millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and in very short order, billions of people will have had their genome sequenced. It's estimated that 2 billion people will have their whole genome sequenced within a decade. So what does that mean? Now you've got 2 billion people with sequenced genomes, and you have access to these roughly or uniform enough electronic health and life records. And then humans become a big data analytics problem. We're here at Google, and you guys understand big data analytics. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, people thought there was this magic, inexplicable magic in humans. But I think many of us would recognize that humans are just single-cell organisms gone wild over billion years of evolution. And just as we can understand pretty well how single-cell organisms function with the tools we have today, with the tools that people like you are developing, we are going to have the ability to understand much more, not just of our genomics, but of the complex systems of our biology. And part of the easy graph for that is the complexity of our biology has remained constant for millions of years, but the sophistication of our tools is on an exponential J-curve. So now we are increasingly being able to understand not just the simple genetics, because we have a number of diseases, disorder, and traits that are single gene mutation, meaning it's like an on-off switch, whether it's Tay-Sachs or sickle cell disease or Huntington's disease, the so-called Mendelian disease, or genetically relatively simple traits like hair color and eye color. But we're moving into a world where we're going to use something called polygenic scoring to be able to make predictions of complex diseases, disorders, and traits. And that's going to move healthcare from this world of precision very quickly into a world of prediction. And so you are going to have information, your parents will have information from a few days after your egg is fertilized. Or people will have information about their children from the moment of birth. And that is going to include information about the percentage greater than average risk of having some bad things happen, or the percentage greater than average probability or possibility of having great things happen, like having super capabilities, whether it's health or anything else. And so the second change that's going to push is a change where genomics, which right now we think of in the context of healthcare, is going to move way, way, way beyond healthcare, because our genome isn't just about healthcare. We don't have a healthcare genome. We have a human genome. And that human genome tells us about who we are in every way. You look around the room, I don't see a bunch of healthcare. I see a bunch of people who have a different genetic foundation. That's why you look different. That's why you are different. Yes, environment still matters. But we are primarily genetic beings. And we're going to understand a lot more of the underlying genetics of what it means to be human. So right now, I'm sure many of you have done your mouth swabs through companies like 23andMe, and you get information back, and certainly about your carrier status, which is about these on-off switch single gene mutation disorders. That's actually relevant. There's some fun stuff like your ancestry. I'm actually 0.01% Yakut, and shout out to any Yakuts in the house. I guess there aren't any. But in the future, you parents and people are going to have a lot of information about all sorts of traits. Like I have a greater than average possibility of being really excellent at abstract math, or sprinting, or having an outgoing personality. Anything that is partly genetic, we are going to be able to increasingly predict the genetic component. Healthcare, non-healthcare, everything that has a genetic foundation. That means that the genetics and genomics revolution is moving way, way, way beyond healthcare. But the third application, the killer application, is in reproduction. Right now, most people, this is like a test. Right now, most people on Earth create babies through sex. Good. This is why Google has such a high market cap. Smart people like it. Right, through sex. And sex has really worked well for our species for hundreds of millions of years. It's how we got here. But there's a risk that's woven into sex. And that risk is that about 3% of all children are born with some kind of harmful genetic abnormality. And we are going to be able to reduce that risk very significantly, provided that we don't conceive our babies through sex. Because the way to do this will be to use IVF, which is a technology that's been around for more than 40 years, and screen embryos using a process called preimplantation genetic testing. It's been around for more than 30 years. And right now, this is used to screen for these simple genetic diseases and disorders and chromosomal abnormalities. But as we develop this greater knowledge of genomics, and in very short order, we're going to be able to use this kind of screening with a lot of knowledge about very human traits. Height, IQ, personality style, so many other things that have a genetic component. As I said, life has a genetic component. And then beyond that, we are going to use stem cell technologies. The 2012 Nobel Prize was given to Shinya Yamanaka, who developed a process for creating what are called induced pluripotent stem cells, IPS cells. And what IPS cells are is that that process allows us to take adult cells and induce them into stem cells. And then those stem cells can be turned, in this case, into egg precursor cells, and egg precursor cells into eggs. And so now, when the average woman undergoing IVF has about 15 eggs extracted, now using IPS cells, we are going to be able to have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. So let's call it 10,000. Because if you're using, let's say, a skin graft, there's millions of skin cells in a skin graft. Average male ejaculation, I don't know if this is the way you guys talk at Google, but average male ejaculation has about 1 billion sperm cells, so that's readily available. Fertilize 10,000 eggs, grow them all for about 5 days, extract a few cells from each, sequence them, and the cost of genome sequencing has gone down from about $1 billion in 2003 to about $800 today, to really negligibility in under a decade. So sequence 10,000 of these early stage pre-implanted embryos, and then you have to pick what you're looking for. I mean, some of you may have seen my editorial in the New York Times last week about this, but in that editorial, I was imagining, what will it be like to go to a fertility clinic in 2045? And basically, what you're going to need to do is say, here are my priorities. So certainly health will be at the top of everybody's priority list. I want to have a kid who's going to be healthy, who's not going to, for example, die of some terrible genetic disease. But when it will be an option to choose healthy lifespan, to say that we know that there are genetic patterns that would allow or increase the odds that somebody could live a longer and healthier life than many of the other embryos that would be the options might, people will want that. And right now, you can say, we can make a pretty good guess of your 15 fertilized egg. We can probably rank them pretty well from tallest potentially to shortest, provided they get the necessary inputs like healthy food. But in 10 years, in 20 years, I think it's quite likely we're going to be able to say we can make a pretty rough but informed guess ranking your pre-implanted embryos based on which is likely to have the highest to lowest genetic component of IQ. And that's a very, very different way of thinking about making babies than what we've done in the past. And then beyond that, there is technology of gene editing. Many of you have heard of CRISPR. Many of you know what happened in China last year, where it was announced in November that 2 Chinese twins had been born the month before in October, whose genomes had been edited by an extremely unethical Chinese biophysicist, not a biologist, not a physician, a biophysicist. But we are in the era of precision gene editing. And even had this not happened last year, it would have happened next year or the year after. It's been done much more responsibly, in a much more transparent way, and it would have been done to address an actual threat to these future children, not to attempt, and it looks like it was a failed attempt, to confer an enhancement or an advantage. But we are moving toward the era of precision gene editing of pre-implanted embryos. I don't think we're going to do, I'm speaking at a panel at Harvard later tonight with George Church, and George is leading a process for making multiple genetic changes simultaneously, and that can work well in plants. It probably can work well in animals, but in humans, I think that's going to be risky for a very long time. But we will absolutely be able to make a small number of genetic changes, either to reduce or eliminate risks, and or to confer benefits. And that's where we are going. And this science is advancing extremely, extremely rapidly. And it's expanding in a context of humanity, of our humanity and our world. And it's a world where people are different, communities are different, and countries are different. So within any country, certainly within this country, the United States, there are going to be people, and many of you know them, who are these transhumanist biohackers who say, this is great, no holes barred, let's race into this transhumanist future. And there are others who are going to say, this is really scary, we're quote unquote playing God, we can't do it. And there will be differences. And people are going to try to do whatever is in line with their value system. And the same thing is going to happen on an international level. There may be entire countries, this may be one of them, that decide to entirely opt out. Just to say, this is really scary, we don't know enough to start making these kinds of changes. There are certainly going to be unintended consequences. Better we not do it at all. Better we forego potential benefits because we think the risk is too high. And that's a legitimate choice that some countries will make. And there will be other countries that will say, hey, we recognize that using this technology, we can dramatically reduce potentially healthcare costs. We can confer all kinds of advantages, whether on an individual or a population level, and that's going to be appealing to some countries. And this process is going to be pushed forward in a very significant way because we live in a competitive world. People are competing with each other, and countries are competing with each other. I have a good friend in Korea who has 12 tutors coming every week for his 11-year-old daughter coming to the house. In Korea, they have a law now that national cram schools have to close at 10 p.m. because people were having their 7- and 8-year-old kids staying out until after midnight every night, 7 days a week, prepping for exams that they were going to take 10 years into the future. And when I asked my friend, I said, hey, if you could select among your natural pre-implanted embryos to try to pick the one that was going to have a competitive advantage by potentially having a higher, at least genetic component of IQ than the others, he looked at me like I was insane. He's like, it was like, is that even a choice? And when I said of the people you know who are competing for access to these universities, if they had a choice, what would they do? And it just, honestly, he looked at me like, it used to say like I was from Mars. Now being from Mars is like normal, like from Pluto. And that's where we are heading. There are all of these kinds of competitive pressures. And because this science is moving so quickly, because there are all these forces propelling it forward, now is the time where we need to say, hey, what are the values that we need to apply to make sure that this great hope, this great dream, doesn't become a nightmare? And there's a lot of real things to be worried about. Certainly what we're talking about are incredibly complex systems. The genome is complex enough, but the genome is embedded within the multi-omic system biology of what makes us human, which is dynamic and interactive. And then our entire biology is constantly interacting with the environment around us. So nothing is static. You could understand it would be very difficult, but if you understood a human perfectly in one moment, the next moment everything would change, and you would need to understand the human perfectly in that next moment to maintain your level of comprehension. So we need to be cautious about meddling with systems that we don't fully understand. And equity issues. Right now, if this technology is as powerful as I believe it will be, what happens if some communities and groups and even countries have a lot more access than others? We need inequality. There have to be first movers with any technology, and that will have to be the case here. But we've also seen what happens when there are too great of divisions. It can be very disruptive. It can be disruptive internally within a country. It can be disruptive internationally because there are all these kinds of differences, as I said. So we really need to be mindful of the equity issues. Diversity. I look around a room like this, you say, well, it's great that we have this diversity. And I'm sure that having diversity makes Google a stronger company. But that's not what diversity is. I mean, it's a one manifestation of it. Diversity, in its essence, is our sole survival strategy as a species. If we didn't have diversity, you could say we'd still be single-cell organisms, but we wouldn't even be that, because what we call diversity, Darwin called random mutation. And if we were all exactly the same, the environment wouldn't have sustained the exact same single-cell organism for 4 billion years. We wouldn't even be here. And so we think about making changes that even make a lot of sense to us, like, for example, eliminating disease risk, even of these relatively simple Mendelian disorders. We think we're doing something good because it's scary to be a carrier of some kind of potentially deadly disease. But if you use the classic case of sickle cell disease, it's terrible to have sickle cell disease, and you will, in most cases, die very young. But if you are a carrier of sickle cell disease, you actually have increased resistance to malaria. So we could eliminate some kind of thing that we think is terrible, but it could have some kind of benefit that we don't know because it hasn't been tested in the world that we have known to date, but maybe that will be tested in the future. So we really need to be mindful of our diversity. And the challenge is that this technology is moving extremely rapidly, and we're going to have to make very big decisions before we fully understand the consequences of the decisions we will make. And that is a really big challenge, and it's a really big responsibility. And the good news for us, though, is that while the technology is new, the values that we're going to need to bring to bear to use it wisely are in many cases very old. We are really going to have to ask ourselves, who are we? What are our values? How do we apply those values in making the huge decisions that we are going to have to make over the coming years? Because the genetics revolution is not just coming. The genetics revolution is here. It's here now, it's happening, it's changing the world around us, but that speed of change is only going to pick up. And it's going to touch us in very, very intimate ways. And the difference between having this play out in a way that does as much as possible to help us and bring us together, and having it play out in a way that could harm us in many ways for unnecessary reasons because we haven't done a good enough job of applying our values. The difference between those outcomes is us. And so the reason why I've written this book is I feel that this revolution is so important, we can't leave it to the experts. The scientists are actually doing a very good job of meeting. I'm participating in many of those conversations. But this isn't an issue just for the scientists. This is about our future. It's really up to all of us. So on an individual level, what are our responsibilities? So everybody needs to be informed. And everybody needs to recognize that if there is going to be a bottom-up push to encourage our representatives and others to really address these issues in a way that can optimize the good stuff and minimize the harm, we're all going to have to be part of that. So I really want everybody here to feel that you are now informed and that you can be a hub in this kind of conversation. But then on a national level, we really need to make sure that all of our countries have the regulatory infrastructures that can manage these kinds of issues. The United Kingdom, in my mind, is the gold standard for what a well-regulated country on this set of issues looks like. And the US is somewhere in the middle. The FDA is actually a very effective agency and does a pretty good job of weighing risks and benefits of various interventions. But there are parts of the world that are either under-regulated or have good rules that aren't well enforced, and China is certainly an example of that. And then there are places which are regulatory black holes where there's really nothing. And that can't be, because if we have the kind of tourism, medical tourism that we've had very dangerously for stem cell treatments, for this, it could have very, very significant consequences. It could actually And on an international level, so on a national level, every country needs to have a regulatory system. It doesn't need to be the same. It needs to be based on best practices. It needs to be based on each country's and traditions of values and ethics and culture. But every country needs something. And then on an international level, we really need to begin a process of coming together to develop global rules. I'm on the World Health Organization International Advisory Committee on the future of human genome editing. And we're trying to think about what might an international system look like. But we are a long way. We collectively are a long way from there. And so what we need to do is have what I'm calling a species-wide dialogue on the future of human genetic engineering. Everybody needs to be part of that. As a matter of fact, I've set up my website as a very humble first step, hackingdarwin.com, where people can go and share views. But then what we need to do is to make sure that those conversations on an individual level, on a group level, can feed up through governments. One of the reasons that my publisher and I are making this book, Hacking Darwin, available for free to any member of parliament of any country in the world is we think it's so important that we have these conversations on the individual, on the communal, and on the national level. But what we have to do is work to make sure that these conversations lead to norms, which lead to standards, which lead to regulations, which lead to laws. Because what we are talking about here is the future of life. And it must be regulated, but it must be regulated well. And because we are at this incredible inflection moment, at the beginning of this revolution that's going to change our lives, because the difference between the greatest upside and the most frightening downside is us. We all need to feel empowered. We all need to recognize that we are the shapers of this future in which we and our children will live. And I welcome you to join me on this journey. So thank you.
Do you think this system of whatever mechanism is the thing that is actually allowing us to choose, like IQ, better traits, what have you, do you think it's even possible to exist in, or to have that exist ethically in a market economy or a market system?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know the answer, but I do know that people are going to be making these choices. I do know that we aren't going to want people to choose anything, and there will have to be some kind of restrictions. And that doesn't mean that there will be all kinds of very sensitive issues that we raise on issues like skin color. But also there will be people, and there already are people who are saying, for example, deaf parents who want to have a deaf child, and this is already happening in the United States where this is legal, who are choosing embryos to guarantee that those children will be deaf. Is that something we're going to be comfortable with? When it's a choice, will we be comfortable with parents choosing to implant embryos that will have genetic disorders or diseases that will kill those kids at an early age? I think we're going to be uncomfortable with that. There will be all kinds of other options. And just as you mentioned in your question, IQ, height. And I think that those people are going to want to make those choices. And then the question is, where does ethics come from? Does ethics come from law, or does ethics come from culture? And I think that in different societies will have different answers to that question. In the places where it comes from law, there will be restrictions. This may be one of those places. There will be other places where it will come from culture, and then there may well be places like black holes where people go to do whatever they want.
Yeah, I was actually questioning, I mean, do you think the system at all could exist? Like, not even just like the mechanism by which we edit genes, but the systems themselves could exist on a by-nation basis? Because if you even consider something like IQ, or like trending towards like a certain trait, fast running, or like a certain pattern recognition, what have you, do you think, I mean, at that point we would have to have some sort of an international regulation on discrimination based on those things? Because if someone who is quote unquote selected genetically by their parents to run quickly
Right.
or to do something like that, if they were to go get a job at something that wasn't what they were effectively built for,
Right.
Is it wrong to say, like, no? I mean, in my case, like, if I listened to what my parents did, I wouldn't be here right now. Like, I would be, I don't know, a doctor or a lawyer somewhere, but like, I'm not sure if it's fully ethical or even in any way possible for that to exist ethically in a...
Yeah, I think it's a very legitimate view, and there are many others who believe that and who will believe that. And as I mentioned when I was talking about the diversity, there will be others who believe differently. And in an ideal world, and I'd love to live in that world, and I'm doing my best with the World Health Organization to try to do a little bit toward building it, we would have some international standards about what happens and what doesn't happen. I had a piece come out in courts yesterday about how I think that this issue could lead to international conflict, because a society that opts out for exactly the kinds of ethical reasons that you described, what are they going to do if another country opts in? Are they going to make it illegal for their people to procreate with people from that other country? Are they going to do genetic testing of every woman who may be pregnant who's coming in? I mean, these issues are really tough. There's no easy answer, but ethics are at the core of everything, and either we're going to find a way that's better than what we have now to apply ethics, or this could get very ugly.
No, certainly. I mean, even in the case that you mentioned, the most upcoming, or the most quickly upcoming, which is the sequencing of genomes to predict medical maladies as you go through life. I mean, if you consider that in like America alone, forget pre-existing conditions. You don't have to show a pre-existing condition to know that you have
Well,
one.
everybody has a pre-existing condition for something once we look under the hood.
No, of course. But now it's not that we require a look under the hood to see that. We don't actually have to present that pre-existing condition anymore. An insurance company can just know, we have access to your genetic information, and we can charge you a shitload more.
Yeah, and so so right now we have the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, which makes it illegal for insurance companies to discriminate against you based on your genetic information, but it's still legal for life insurance companies to do so. So maybe we'll give a chance for other people to ask questions, but these are the issues, and they're not easy. And the point is, there aren't answers. I think your question is a great one. We have to be struggling with them now, but we're spending so much of our time focusing on these issues that are less important. And this is something where everybody needs to be involved. We need our leaders to be involved, because the exact issues that you described are the ones we need to be wrestling with.
So I believe this is coming, and humans have a hard time putting genies back in bottles. So the first people to do this will probably be rich.
Yes.
And we're talking about something that can give crazy advantages to initial entrants.
Yes.
And it will, I was listening to an NPR article, and they were saying we could have two different species, the rich person species and the poor person species.
The Eloi and the Morlocks. Yeah.
And so what is the World Health Organization doing about this, or thinking about this?
Yeah. I'm working with the World Health Organization, and the answer is something, but nobody is doing enough. I mean, this is such an important issue, and it's just being massively underaddressed. So there will be first adopters of this technology, like every technology. But we've seen what happens when there are first adopters of the machine gun. You can really skew the way the world looks. And on one hand, there will be some democratic pressures, just in the sense that there will be huge savings to at least rational healthcare systems that these technologies can bring. And from a theoretical perspective, in a country like the UK, where you have a national health system and a rational regulator, you can think about, well, if we're going to eliminate lots of genetic diseases that cost hundreds of billions of pounds per year or more to treat, and we distribute that benefit across the population by providing free IVF and embryo screening to everybody who wants to have a baby, that is a rational thing. But even in that system, there are going to be people, because we are humans and humans are crazy, who want more. And so I think it's just, again, it's a very, very real issue. But what I will say about these equity issues, which are so serious in the future, that if we care, if those are our values, that we don't want to live in a world that's divided genetically in the future, the best way to fix that is to look at our values now. If we're perfectly comfortable having the average kid born in the Central African Republic being born with brain damage because his mother is malnourished, and so that kid's brain will not function as well as our kids' brains will function, even though it's not based on genomics, if we're comfortable with that world and that world is okay for us, how can we expect that there's going to be a different us in the future? But if we say our values are to live our principles of equity today, when we get to the future, we'll know who we are and we'll be able to apply those values. Yeah.
I just want to start by saying this conversation made me super uncomfortable, but that's exciting because I like when things sort of disrupt my expectations of what's going to come.
Good.
I sort of live for those moments. I live for
Great.
that moment where you walk into the water and you take a couple extra steps and then
Great.
you're floating. So what I think is kind of interesting is you're sort of talking about this continuum of stuff.
Yeah.
Like you've got your genome, and if we can sort of edit it to make you more healthy, to live longer, that's one definition. That's a belief system for saying like that's a better life.
Right.
I think when you talk about making someone more intelligent or making someone run faster, it's pretty clear that's a superlative, you're making them better. But what about the lens of not the IQ, but the EQ? What about the emotional quotient? What about the space of creativity, the space of cultural norms, the fact that forgetting things means the things you remember are meaningful? And certainly this is less of a technology-driven question, more of a question about like what makes us human.
Yep.
And I guess just sort of at a high level, I'm curious, how does that work its way into your thoughts as you start to extend beyond medicine?
Yeah, it's such an essential question because if we, any of us, think of this as a conversation about science, we've missed the whole point. This is a conversation about humanity's values and ethics, and it's set in the context of a revolutionary technology and revolutionary science. So we have to be focusing on those things. But the challenge for us is that diversity for the last almost 4 billion years has just been something that happens to us. Like we didn't say, like I didn't say, oh, I want to be born looking like whatever I look like or having whatever genetic inheritance that I have. My parents didn't say that other than in the process of meeting each other. But now these things that have just happened are going to increasingly become choices. And that's essentially the point that I was making when I talked about diversity. That we are going to have to articulate something that just happened to us. And if we think that the only way to have value in this world is to have 15 or 20 or 50 higher points on an IQ test, we are going to destroy our humanity. And not only that, we're going to become less good at a lot of things that we collectively do. And so I'm not saying that everybody, as a matter of fact, what I am saying is if everybody starts making the same choices based on our cultural biases of things that seem perfectly good, and we don't have a conversation about diversity, which is essentially the core point of what you're making, and how we value it, and how we're going to realize that in a world where biology is manipulable and a choice, we are going to drive ourselves into potentially even an evolutionary cul-de-sac. And the drivers won't be authoritarian governments. The drivers will be the most well-meaning parents who are trying to give advantages for their kids in the world as they see it. And so I totally agree with the premise of your question. And so I'm sorry that I have the same answer to every question. But that's why we have a little bit of a head start now. That if we imagine if we could have had an open conversation at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution or at the beginning of the nuclear revolution about, well, we know this stuff is coming. What are the values that we want to weave into everything? And we have a little window before everybody retreats to their barricades, and that will happen. It will happen soon. So this is that window. And one of the reasons why I like speaking with groups like you is that I feel like this is a conversation that we're all part of, and we all need to be hubs in that conversation. Yeah.
Do you see abortion laws today that we have in this country and, let's say, let me put it out, in the world, as any indicator of how the World Health Organization rules are being laid out? Because I feel like you aptly mentioned, that there's always going to be two sides.
Yeah.
And how do you see other, like,
sure. It's a
your
great
work
question.
being applied into that?
So the debates that we've had over issues like abortion and genetically modified crops are highly relevant to where we may be going. And they're also a warning that with abortion, in the abortion debate, there are people on the various sides who have staked out extremely rigid positions. And here in the United States, the politics of abortion makes it much more difficult to have these kinds of conversations on a national level than is the case in other places. And again, the United Kingdom is a good example of that. But when we look at abortion, you have to ask yourself, if you believe that life begins at conception, why is it that we have picketers and protesters in front of clinics where abortions are taking place, but we don't have them in front of fertility clinics? Because if life begins at conception, the place where abortions are happening, that's retail, but the fertility clinics, that's wholesale. And if you think that's murder, that's where it's happening. But why aren't the picketers there? And the reason is because this technology has normalized, and people in those communities, they see these parents who have benefited from the miracle of life, who otherwise wouldn't have, and they don't like to admit it, but they recognize that there is a cost and a benefit. And genetically modified crops are another example where the scientists actually did a pretty good job of setting ground rules and behaving responsibly since the 1970s. But the public didn't feel, the general public on average didn't feel that they were part of that process. And so now you have pretty much all of the science Nobel Prize winners alive who are repeatedly saying GMOs are safe for human consumption, which they are. And yet people have this gut feeling, particularly but not exclusively in Europe, that there's something wrong with GMOs because it's not natural. And now millions of people need to be harmed in Africa and South Asia because they can't grow GMO crops, because if they do, they won't be able to export to Europe, and agriculture is their main industry. So I keep coming back to the same point. So if we want to have a meaningful conversation that can guide us and lead us toward optimizing the benefits of this incredibly powerful and in many ways wonderful technology, we all need to engage. We need to see ourselves as shapers of this information and ultimately regulatory environment. Yes.
I was very happy to hear the piece about skin cells being able to turn those back into eggs, because the undertone of a lot of this is medicalization and control for how women reproduce.
Yeah.
Not as a goal, but
Right.
as a consequence. And it ties back to the comments about why don't people picket IVF clinics, has a lot more to do with control. I mean, one can always argue about that. But, and then you take this also, you tie it to what we already see happening across Asia in terms of sex discrimination,
Yep.
abortion, which is warping the population,
Yeah.
right? We already have experience that this is done poorly. And so one of my concerns as you go in the world working on this is that there are actually women, and there's work going on the reproduction side. You toss IVF off, oh yes, this is here, it's standardized,
Yeah.
and we have a lot more multiple births,
Yep.
which are hugely,
Well, that's going down. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
but they're riskier,
Yeah.
the chance of it,
Yeah.
the medicalization. I mean, this all has huge implications. We talk about, oh, wouldn't it be lovely if your kids are smarter? You know, I have 3 smart kids, and asynchronous development. There's all of these societal
Yes.
implications that are embedded in the culture assumptions of, oh, this must be great, but getting there
Yeah.
is
I
hugely challenging.
totally agree that there are huge issues of women's health, reproductive health, and we are moving into a new world of biology and how biology works. So I've talked about how egg cells will be created from adult cells. We already have, in the last year, 2 male mice have had their own 100% related biological child. 2 female mice have had their own 100% related biological child. We are moving into a world where biology is fundamentally different than what we have known. And the limits, the possibilities that will bring are in many ways beyond most of our imagination. Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you.